Hello, and welcome to Tech Latest from Nikkei Asia, where we bring you the freshest updates from the technology sector in Asia. In this week's episode, we're talking batteries, specifically vanadium batteries, an alternative to lithium ion that could finally be having its moment in the sun. Joining us to talk about these batteries is our own critical minerals expert in Sydney, Shaun Turton. Welcome to the show, Shaun.
Good to be here. Expert might be a bit generous, but excited to talk about vanadium.
I think you are the best person in our organization to talk about this, so that makes you an expert in my book. And I have to confess, I'd not even heard of vanadium batteries before you pitched your story. So maybe that's a good place to start is what are these exactly and how are they different from the batteries that maybe we're all more familiar with?
Well, vanadium batteries haven't really taken off as much as lithium ion, which I suppose are the most commonly used and, batteries that have sort of powered the EV revolution. But vanadium batteries were pioneered in the 1980s by Australian researchers, University of New South Wales. As it is evident in the name, it uses the element vanadium, which sort of has long been used as a sort of additive to steel. It creates an alloy that's, both stronger and lighter. So, ever since the early sort of 1900s, Henry Ford used it in the Model T chassis, and it was known about, for its use in the steel industry. But in the 1980s, some Australian researchers, against what was sort of considered to be scientific consensus at the time, sort of proved that electrochemical properties were suitable for batteries. So, they began working on that research in the 1980s and developed a prototype really quickly. Put it in a golf cart, put it into a house in Thailand that was run by solar.
Oh, wow.
But it didn't really take off. And there's sort of a number of reasons for that. But sort of long-established technology that hasn't really had its breakthrough up until recently.
So vanadium batteries were being developed around the same time as lithium ions were also coming to market, or?
I guess lithium-ion batteries have been used for a while, particularly in smaller applications by mobile phones. As mobile phones became more widespread, lithium batteries found a pretty significant use case there. Their use in electronics and particularly electric vehicles, and a lot of investment has sort of seen the cost of them and the efficiencies really increase. Whereas vanadium sort of didn't have that investment, and one of the barriers has been its sort of higher cost. I mean, it's a different type of battery. It's what they call a flow battery, which uses a vanadium electrolyte in sort of liquid form and sort of pumps it between two tanks through a sort of a cell in the middle to create the battery. So, it's the technology is known about for a while and developed, both in Australia and Japan. Some Japanese companies have been working on the tech as well, but its energy density isn't as high as lithium-ion batteries. So, for electric vehicles, lithium-ion were considered a much better fit for that technology.
You don't want to limit your driving range.
Yeah, well, that's still kind of a big concern around people who may be thinking about getting cars, is whether they're going to run out of juice halfway to the beach house. So, but vanadium does have plenty of advantages when it comes to energy storage. So, larger scale storage, whether it be grid, storing power generated by solar farms or wind farms, or, power for big energy users. It's able to be sort of scaled and have longer duration systems, and it's also presents very little fire risk, which
that's important.
Multiple cases, I think South Korea recently had some problems with lithium-ion fires.
EV caught fire in a garage in an apartment complex, I think, which is quite concerning for everyone else living there.
So as batteries become, a bigger part of energy grids, that's a huge consideration. And, where that's happening sort of faster and at a larger scale than anywhere else in the world is China. They're sort of rolling out energy storage at a sort of rate that's, really sort of far ahead of most of the rest of the world.
So I guess China is creating its own market for vanadium batteries, which means it can then commercialize them maybe more efficiently in a way that Australia just missed the opportunity, at least initially.
It's sort of the same, has a sort of similar storyline to electric vehicles. They just have such a large domestic market, and obviously such prowess in manufacturing, and sort of access to perhaps cheaper capital and integrated supply chains. They have both muscle, be able to build fast and quickly and at scale, and then huge local demands to warrant that sort of investment. So vanadium, admittedly, in China is still a small part of their energy storage makeup. It's lithium ions still sort of dominate that space, but it is growing. There are many larger scale projects that have been tendered for recently. So it's seen as a technology that could, after all these years, finally sort of take off.
And what's happening in Australia trying to catch up on this front? There's still some interest in investment?
Yeah, I mean, Australia, as we've sort of written about at Nikkei quite a bit, has big ambitions in the sort of critical mineral manufacturing or clean technology space. It's sort of been a central part of the current government's policy. But, as is sort of happening with rare earths, it has the deposits, but it's just very expensive to set up mines, to set up processing plants, and to set up supply chains in a place like Australia. So there are a couple of companies in Australia that are already producing the vanadium electrolyte, but there's no actual current mining of vanadium in Australia. Briefly was some mining in the past, but that's not going on at the moment. But there are plans and, sort of advocates that sort of really want to potentially take advantage of what is a homegrown technology and build a supply chain. And I suppose one of the points they make is, unlike lithium, which Australia does provide a substantial amount of the world's lithium or raw lithium in sort of the form of spodumene, we don't use that in Australia. We don't make cars anymore, so it all has to be exported, and the main market is China.
Right.
Whereas there is, a potential end use case for vanadium batteries in Australia. We do need storage, so there is, there is theoretically an entire supply chain that could be set up here. But China is so dominant in vanadium. I mean, both from a sort of alloy point of view, but also now increasingly in the battery space, that there's real questions on whether it justifies the cost of Australia investing in mines and processing facilities when you're able to buy this technology. And in the future we'll be able to buy this technology cheaper from China.
Yeah, from a commercial sense, it seems almost ridiculous that anyone would try and have an alternative to the Chinese supply chain, just given how efficient and long established it is. But commercial is not the only consideration these days, especially with Trump now in the White House making rare earths and critical minerals part of his big policy push. And as you said, Australia's government also making this one of their big priorities. Do you think the political will to break away from China and set up alternative supply chains could be enough to overcome the unfavorable economics?
Potentially in some projects, I suppose. But I mean, the problem with a lot of these supply chains that America is now expressing increased interest in onshoring things like rare earths, like they're incredibly complex supply chains, and just having the minerals themselves is only one part of it. I mean, even developing rare earth mineral sort of deposits takes many years. Then you've got to separate them. You need to turn that into metal. You need to turn that into alloy. You need to turn that into magnets. So
and then have buyers for the magnets.
And then have buyers for magnets that are willing to pay the higher costs of producing them domestically rather than getting from a place that's produced them at scale for 20 years. So it is potentially possible in some areas. It will require a lot of subsidies and ongoing support. And that's sort of one of the differences between what China can do and what other countries that have shorter term political sort of timeframes in which they operate, is that this is sort of a decades-long project, to catch up on China after sort of decades of investment in these areas. It won't happen overnight.
Definitely true. And I guess that's the big question, is how committed will governments going forward be to maintaining this effort? Because like you said, just the subsidies alone will be a really hefty kind of burden on government spending. So, and getting voters kind of behind this idea that we need to support something that's not going to pay off maybe for decades is certainly not easy.
Yeah. I mean, one of the issues that Australia has, it often points to its mining heritage. I mean, Australia is sort of leading source of many raw commodities, iron ore, coal, it's a top gas supplier. But I mean, these are bulk commodities. So, for iron ore in particular, you just put it on trains, get it to the port, ship it to China. Whereas things like rare earths and critical minerals, they're used in much smaller quantities, and they require much more sophisticated processing.
That's a good point.
Chemical level sort of processing, and it's a real challenge to do in a place like Australia where you have much more onerous regulations. You have for good reason, for safety and for environmental standards.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you need someone to pay the cost of what it costs to produce. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it is needing to set up alternate supply chains from China is about is almost a bet on geopolitical scenarios making it impossible for this current supply chain to work. Whether it's tariffs, whether it's punitive measures by China to restrict supply, and that has happened in some materials.
Yeah, we have seen that.
So, I mean, that is a genuine concern that places like the US and Australia have about their reliance. Whether that can prompt the actual money that needs to be spent to set up alternate supplies is a different question.
And do they see the cost of doing that as being worth the potential that this might happen, something that we have to just kind of project years in the future what the relationship between China and the West or China and any single country might be? It is asking a lot. Yeah,
and if it's in this context of energy transition, part of that is a time imperative as well. We want to get people using less carbon intensive technology as soon as possible. But if your other objective is to onshore that, which is slower and more expensive, then that starts to conflict with the other priority. So, yeah, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, and just to throw one more spanner in the works is the transition to green energy is not a straight path forward, as we've seen. The U.S. is rolling back a lot of its aims and targets and is happy to be using more fossil fuels if they can source them domestically. So maybe even the kind of imperative for more green technologies won't be as strong as we hoped it would be maybe a few years ago. So
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of shift because on one hand, Trump has moved away from policies of the Biden administration that sought to incentivize more, battery supply chains and critical mineral supply chains in America under the sort of framework or the narrative of the energy transition. But he's still pursuing critical minerals, but sort of under the narrative of self-reliance and, reducing dependencies on China, which Trump has sort of characterized as a sort of national security threat.
Right.
So, I mean, potentially similar directions, but under different narratives. But again, none of that really overcomes the sort of immense challenges in building out domestic supply chains while also competing with producers like China and other parts of Asia that can do it much cheaper.
No, that was a really great look at part of the critical minerals segment that I think we're going to see playing out again and again, up and down the periodic table. So,
I mean, I guess the one thing we could also say is that in terms of the vanadium ambitions in Australia and elsewhere, it has similarities to previous developments in clean technology, that being the PV cells that support solar energy, which were also pioneered in Australia, so quickly commercialized and brought to scale by China. So Australia wants to be able to sort of leverage its pretty remarkable history and track record in innovation into broadening its economic base. But it's not straightforward. I mean, the government has announced a lot of money for this, money for that, but as the sort of China model demonstrates, you need sustained support for many, many, many years.
Yeah, the path from the lab to the factory is not a straight one if you're not set up for that kind of production.
I mean, the vanadium story would be a great story for Australia if they could pull it off. From the lab to to the mine to the batteries. You're sucking in the solar power when the sun's shining and the wind power when the wind's blowing, and then helping Australia as well sort of decrease its reliance on fossil fuels. It sort of forms part of a bigger picture that it would be great if some of this could be realized.
Well, looking forward to reading your next story on it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure. That's all for this week's episode. For more of Nikkei Asia's tech coverage, visit asia.nikkei.com. You can also subscribe to our weekly Tech Asia newsletter, which will be delivered to your inbox every Thursday. Thanks again for listening, and check back with us next week for more updates on the tech trends that matter.